I'm Don Hudson, and I will be teaching the course Bible Study That Matters this semester. And I'd like to say a couple of things up front about this class. First of all, I teach at King University, and I am chair of the Philosophy and Religion Department. I want you to know a couple of things about Bible Study That Matters, and a little bit of what we're thinking about, both as an introduction to the course, but also as an introduction to Module 1. As you will see, we have 5 modules, and I will be doing an introduction to each one of those modules. But I'd like to talk about the class in general and then a little bit about this particular module. First of all, one of the reasons why we are calling this Bible Study That Matters is because we're trying to focus on two things, two realities. If you took a Bible study course in most colleges or seminaries, it would probably be called hermeneutics, or an introduction to the study of the Bible through the inductive method. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, and those are good terms, but a lot of people don't understand what that means. And so part of what we're doing is we're doing hermeneutics. We are going to do what is called an inductive study of the Bible, but we want to call this class Bible Study That Matters. And let me give you 2 ideas with that. First of all, I think it's very, very important as we begin this course of study, which is, again, this course, but also the religious studies online. As we begin this, it's very, very important that we have some rules for interpretation. What I mean by that is not necessarily you can do this and you can't do this. What I really mean is there are things that both can restrain us as we go to the text, but also can help us as we read the text. So one of the things that we're concerned about, and Christians all across the world are very concerned about this, when we read the Bible, do we read in such a way that we make the Bible say something that it doesn't say, or do we really understand what the Bible is saying? Scholars will talk about the difference between eisegesis and exegesis. And eisegesis is a Greek term that means to read into the text. Exegesis is to draw out of the text. And so one of the reasons why we're talking about rules and restraint is so that we can't make the Bible into whatever we want it to say. Scholars talk about this being subjective interpretation, and opposed to that is objective interpretation. We want to invite you to think about objective interpretation, studying the Bible in a way that takes the text as it is. What did it mean from those authors and editors to those people in that day? And so as we begin Bible Study That Matters, it's very, very important that we take the Bible seriously. And what I mean by that is that we really have a good method for reading that allows us to understand the text. The second term that is very important, Bible study that speaks to the human condition. And I think this is very important, and this is a distinctive at King University, because very basically, if you say that the Bible is true, which we hold to, that also means that the Bible speaks to our lives, that it addresses us as human beings, and it says something to us in our ultimate concerns. And so part of what we're striving for in this course and in our religious studies online is the idea that we really read the Bible in an objective, honest, educated way. But then at the end of the day, that should say something to us in 2014. And so one of the things that we want you to walk away with is not only how to read the Bible, but then also how the Bible speaks to us as modern day humans living in the year 2014. Let me give you an example of this. When I teach Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, I tell my students that the most important date is 586 BCE. 586 BCE. And so I have a quiz that covers this. We cover this on a midterm, and we even cover this on the final. My students probably at the end of their Old Testament class, they're just totally tired of the date 586. But when they come out of that course, they know that 586 BCE is a date that is very important because this is when the Babylonians destroyed Judah, at least Jerusalem in Judah. This is when the Babylonians destroyed the temple, and they took many of the Jews to Babylon, and this is called the Babylonian captivity. Here at King, it's very important that our students know the history of 586, but we also want you to know the significance of 586. And so, who cares is what we're saying. So what about 586? Just because you know 586 doesn't mean that you've really dealt with the scriptures or the context of the scriptures. Can you really speak to what 586 meant? And then, does it have any meaning for today? And so I want my students, yes, to know that 586 is very important. And the book of Jeremiah deals with this, and Ezekiel and Ezra and Nehemiah after this. That's very important, but I also want my students to realize that this speaks to us as human beings in very powerful ways. And so in 586, the Jews lost their identity to a certain level. They lost their temple. They had questions about their God. And so much of the literature of the Old Testament is really an outpouring, an expression of grappling with what happened in 586. What do we do when we serve a good God, but there are bad things in life? What do we do when God gave these promises, but now it looks like those promises have been broken? And so there's so much about the Hebrew Bible that's revolving around questions of human existence and around God and who is God and what does it mean to face tragedy in a very honest way. So back to this idea, basically, that Bible study that matters is approaching two realities or trying to deal with two realities. Number one, how do we read the Bible in a way that is effective and reliable? And then number two, how do we read the Bible and interpret the Bible in such a way that it actually speaks to us as human beings? And so in this way, I'm saying that I want us to read in a way that is very relevant. Now, so two words that hopefully you can take away from this. Our reading, we think, should be reliable, and we also think that it should be relevant. Another thing that is very important to us is understanding that traditionally, especially since about the 1950s in America, 1940s, 50s, 60s in America, when scholars and religious leaders talked about reading the Bible, they would divide the interpreting process, the reading process, into two categories. They would talk about, and we've seen this word already, exegesis, and then they would also talk about application. Some scholars will talk about interpretation and application. And so kind of this idea, and this emerges out of the change of thinking that we had in the empirical age and in the Renaissance, in the Enlightenment. Part of this thinking is essentially you've got to, once again, read the text in an objective way, and we agree with that. And once you've read the text in an objective way, then you can go to applying the scriptures. All right, we've seen this already. Here at King, and one of the distinctives of this course is understanding that reading and interpreting the Bible really does not occur in that clean way, if you will. It's not that we can bring ourselves to the text as a blank slate and then go and make meaning for that text. It's impossible. It's humanly impossible. And so one of the greatest contributions from scholarship, philosophy, hermeneutics, religious studies in the last 30 to 40 years is recognizing and admitting we already bring a worldview to the text. We can't pretend we don't have that. And there's a negative aspect to that, but there's also a positive aspect to that. And part of that is knowing what that worldview is. And so let me put it this way. Here at King and in this course, we know that rather than having a process of interpretation and application, we're actually saying that application becomes before interpretation. In other words, I already bring a worldview to the text, and I need to be aware of that. I need to know what that is. I need to know, if you will, the good aspects of what I bring to the text and the bad aspects. And so part of what I would say is, especially as a Christian, I already bring a theology to the text. Application, if you will, is already happening. And so to admit we already bring application, if you will, or a theology to the text, interpretation, which is very important, and then to move on to application, I think that's a more honest approach, and I think it's also a more beneficial approach. When we do that, it hinders our reading, but it also helps our reading. And let me illustrate this example. In Genesis chapter 3, it is the introduction of the serpent in the garden. And it says that the serpent was more crafty than any other creature on earth. And then the serpent, of course, begins to address the first humans according to Genesis, and that is Adam and Eve. Now, it's very important to understand the context of this text, and this is what we will deal with in this entire course. The context of this text is essentially a Jewish or Israelite community writing to a Jewish or Israelite community 2,500 years ago, 3,000 years ago. Many, many years ago, millennia ago, these are people who are writing a text, and a serpent comes into the text. Well, that becomes very, very important. And so part of what I'm talking about is, how is it that I bring a worldview or application already to the text? I think this will be an example. When I teach a class, both in foundations or on foundations of Christian faith and practice, and when I teach the Old Testament, I do this with my students with Genesis chapter 3 and verse 1. I ask my students, who is the serpent? And every single time after 30 years of teaching, I get the same answer. And the answer is Satan or the devil. And then my response back to that is, where do you see that? Where is that in the text? And I draw their attention back to the text, and basically I tell them, there's a serpent here. And as soon as you make it into Satan, you've done two things. First of all, you have read your worldview already into the text. The second thing is you've made the text say something that it doesn't say. In other words, now your interpretation is actually a subjective interpretation. But to me, we also lose something from the text, because one of the things I want you to think about is, what did it mean to those people back then? What did it mean to them back then? Why is there a serpent in the text? And are there serpents in other creation stories outside of Israel and outside of Judah? And the answer is absolutely yes. The Epic of Gilgamesh is one example. So if we can come back to this idea, there's a serpent in that text. What did it mean back then? What is the meaning then? And then to move on from there. Yes, when you get to the New Testament, it talks about the serpent of old. This is in particular in the book of Revelation. The serpent of old is called Satan. And so later on, when we have the Christian New Testament and we have the Christian worldview, there is more information about who the serpent was at that point. And so, once again, if you want to come in and say this is the serpent, we have to be very, very careful, because we have to say the text says this in Genesis, and what did it mean back then? And then we have another text in the New Testament years later that comes in and helps us understand this. In my opinion, and I think it's very important for us to do this as we interpret the scriptures, essentially, what did it mean then in Genesis chapter 3? And then how was it interpreted later? And then it's also important to see the history of interpretation as we go through the ages. This course, it's not enough to just study how to read the Bible, to interpret the Bible. Yes, that's very important, and that restrains us and that helps us. But it's also important that we understand who we are as we come to the text. How do we read as we read the text? And so as you begin this first week, we want you to think about who you are as you read the text, and what presuppositions and assumptions and theologies do you already bring to the text that might get in the way, but also might help you.